This is Audible.
Time Warner Audiobooks presents Split Second, written by David Baldacci and read by Scott Brick. Prologue, September 1996. It only took a split second. Although to Secret Service agent Sean King, it seemed like the longest split second ever. They were on the campaign trail at a nondescript hotel meet and greet in a place so far out you had to use long distance to reach the boonies. Standing behind his protectee, King scanned the crowd while his ear mic buzzed sporadically with unremarkable information. It was muggy in the large room filled with excited people waving "Elect Clyde Ritter" pennants. There were more than a few infants being thrust toward the smiling candidate. King hated this because the babies could so easily shield a gun until it was too late. Yet the little ones just kept coming, and Clyde kissed them all, and ulcers seemed to form in King's belly as he observed this potentially dangerous spectacle. The crowd drew closer, right up to the velvet rope stanchions that had been placed as a line in the sand. In response, King moved closer to Ritter. The palm of his outstretched hand rested lightly on the candidate's sweaty, coatless back so that he could pull him down in an instant if something happened. He couldn't very well stand in front of the man, for the candidate belonged to the people. Ritter's routine never varied. Shake hands, wave, smile, nail a sound bite in time for the 6 o'clock news, then pucker up and kiss a fat baby. And all the time, King silently watched the crowd, keeping his hand on Ritter's soaked shirt and looking for threats. Someone called out from the rear of the space. Ritter answered the jibe back with his own bit of humor, and the crowd laughed good-naturedly, or at least most did. There were people here who hated Ritter and all he stood for. Faces didn't lie, not for those trained to read them, and King could read a face as well as he could shoot a gun. That's what he spent all his working life doing, reading the hearts and souls of men and women through their eyes, their physical tics. He keyed on 2 men in particular 10 feet away on the right. They looked like potential trouble, although each wore a short-sleeved shirt and tight pants with no place to conceal a weapon, which dropped them several pegs on the danger meter. Assassins tended to favor bulky clothing and small handguns. Still, he mumbled a few words into his mic, telling others of his concern. Then his gaze flitted to the clock on the back of the wall. It was 10:32 in the morning. 5 more minutes and they'd be on to the next town, where the handshakes, sound bites, baby kisses, and face reading would continue. King's gaze had turned in the direction of the new sound and then the new sight, something totally unexpected. Standing facing the crowd and behind the hard, politicking Ritter, he was the only one in the room who could see it. His attention stayed there for 1 beat, 2 beats, 3 beats, far too long. Yet who could blame him for not being able to pull his gaze away from that? Everyone, as it turned out, including himself. King heard the bang, like the sound of a dropped book. He could feel the moisture on his hand where it had touched Ritter's back, and now the moisture wasn't just sweat. His hands stung where the slug had come out the body and taken a chunk off his middle finger before hitting the wall behind him. As Ritter dropped, King felt like a comet going hell-bent and still taking 1 billion light years to get where it's actually going. Shrieks from the crowd poured out and then seemed to dissolve into one long, soulless moan. Faces stretched into images one only saw in carnival funhouses. Then the blur hit him like the force of an exploding grenade as feet moved and bodies gyrated and the screams came at him from all directions. People pushed, pulled, and ducked to get out of the way. He remembered thinking, there's no greater chaos than when swift, violent death knocks on the door of an unsuspecting crowd. And now presidential candidate Clyde Ritter was lying by his feet on the hardwood floor, shot right through the heart. King's gaze left the newly deceased and turned toward the shooter, a tall, handsome man in a tweed jacket and wearing glasses. The killer's Smith & Wesson .44 was still pointing at the spot where Ritter had been standing, as though waiting for the target to get back up so he could be shot all over again. The mass of panicked people held back the guards who were fighting to get through, so the king and the killer were the only ones at the party. King pointed his pistol at the chest of the assassin. He gave no warning, called out not one constitutional right accorded the assassin under American jurisprudence. His duty now clear, he fired once, and then again, though the first time was enough. It dropped the man right where he stood. The assassin never said a word, as though he'd expected to die for what he'd done, and accepted the terms stoically like a good martyr should. And all martyrs left behind people like King, the ones who were blamed for letting it happen in the first place. 3 men had actually died that day, and King had been one of them. Sean Ignatius King, born August 1, 1960, died September 26, 1996, in a place he'd never even heard of until the final day of his life. And yet, he had it far worse than the others who had fallen. They went tidily into their coffins and were forever mourned by those who loved them, or at least loved what they stood for. The soon-to-be ex-Secret Service agent King had no such luck. After his death, his unlikely burden was to keep right on living.
Chapter 1.
8 years later. The motorcade streamed into the tree-shaded parking lot where it disgorged numerous people who looked hot, tired, and genuinely unhappy. The miniature army marched toward the ugly white brick building. The structure had been many things in its time and currently housed a decrepit funeral home that was thriving solely because there was no other such facility within 30 miles, and the dead, of course, had to go somewhere. Appropriately somber gentlemen in black suits stood next to hearses of the same color. A few bereaved trickled out the door, sobbing quietly into handkerchiefs. An old man in a tattered suit that was too large for him and wearing a battered, oily Stetson sat on a bench outside the front entrance, whittling. It was just that sort of a place, rural to the hilt, stock car racing and bluegrass ballads forever. The old fellow looked up curiously as the procession passed by with a tall, distinguished-looking man ceremoniously in the middle. The elderly gent just shook his head and grinned at this spectacle, showing the few tobacco-stained teeth he had left. Then he took a nip of refreshment from a flask pulled from his pocket and returned to his artful wood carving. The woman, in her early 30s and dressed in a black pantsuit, was in step behind the tall man. In the past, her heavy pistol in the belt holster had scraped uncomfortably against her side, causing a scab. As a solution, she'd sewn an extra layer of cloth into her blouses at that spot and learned to live with any lingering irritation. She'd overheard some of her men joke that all female agents should wear double shoulder holsters because it gave them a buxom look without expensive breast enhancement. Yes, testosterone was alive and well in her world. Secret Service agent Michelle Maxwell was on the extreme fast track. She was not yet at the White House detail guarding the President of the United States, but she was close. Barely 9 years in the service and she was already a protection detail leader. Most agents spent a decade in the field doing investigative work before even graduating to protection detail as shift agents. Yet Michelle Maxwell was used to getting to places before other folks. This was her big preview before almost certain reassignment to the White House, and she was worried. This was an unscheduled stop, and that meant no advance team and limited backup. Yet because it was a last-minute change in plan, the plus side was no one could know they were going to be there. They reached the entrance, and Michelle put a firm hand on the tall man's arm and told him to wait while they scoped things out. The place was quiet, smelled of death and despair, and quiet pockets of misery centered on coffins in each of the viewing rooms. She posted agents at various key points along the man's path, giving feet, as it was called in service parlance. Properly done, the simple act of having a professional with a gun and communication capability standing in a doorway could work wonders. She spoke into her walkie-talkie, and the tall man, John Bruno, was brought in. She led him down the hallway as gazes from the viewing rooms wandered to them. A politician and his entourage on the campaign trail were like a herd of elephants. They could travel nowhere lightly. They stomped the earth until it hurt with the weight of the guards, chiefs of staff, spokespersons, speechwriters, publicity folks, gophers, and others. It was a spectacle that, if it didn't make you laugh, would at least cause you considerable worry about the future of the country. John Bruno was running for the office of President of the United States, and he had absolutely no chance of winning. Looking far younger than his 56 years, he was an independent candidate who'd used the support of a small but strident percentage of the electorate, fed up with just about everything mainstream, to qualify for each state's national ballot. Thus, he'd been given Secret Service protection, though not at the staffing level of a bona fide contender. It was Michelle Maxwell's job to keep him alive until the election. She was counting the days. Bruno was a former iron balls prosecutor, and he'd made a great number of enemies, some of whom were behind bars and some of whom weren't. His political planks were fairly simple. He'd tell you he only wanted government off the backs of the people and free enterprise to rule. As for the poor and weak, those not up to the task of unfettered competition, well, in all other species the weak died and the strong prevailed, and why should it be any different for us? Largely because of that position, the man had no chance of winning. Although America loved its tough guys, they weren't ready to vote for leaders who exhibited no compassion for the downtrodden and miserable, for on any given day, they might constitute a majority. The trouble started when Bruno entered the room, trailed by his chief of staff, 2 aides, Michelle, and 3 of her men. The widow sitting in front of her husband's coffin looked up sharply. Michelle couldn't see her expression through the veil the woman was wearing, but assumed her look was one of surprise at seeing this herd of interlopers invading hallowed ground. The old woman got up and retreated to a corner, visibly shaking. The candidate whirled on Michelle. "He was a dear friend of mine," Bruno snapped, "and I am not going to parade in with an army." "Get out," he added tersely. "I'll stay," she fired back. "Just me." He shook his head. They'd had many such standoffs. He knew that his candidacy was a hopeless long shot, and that just made him try even harder. The pace had been brutal, the protection logistics a nightmare. "No, this is private," he growled. Bruno looked over at the quivering woman in the corner. "My God, you're scaring her to death. This is repugnant." Michelle went back one more time to the well. He refused yet again, leading them all out of the room, berating them as he did. What the hell could happen to him in a funeral home? Was the 80-year-old widow going to jump him? Was the dead man going to come back to life? Michelle sensed that her protectee was really upset that she was costing him valuable campaign time, yet it wasn't her idea to come here. However, Bruno was in no mood to hear that. No chance to win, and the man acted like he was king of the hill. Of course, on election day, the voters, including Michelle, would kick his butt right out the door. As a compromise, Michelle asked for 2 minutes to sweep the room. This was granted, and her men moved quickly to do so while she silently fumed, telling herself that she had to save her ammo for the really important battles. Her men came out 120 seconds later and reported everything okay. Only one door in and out. No windows. Old lady and dead guy the only occupants. It was cool. Not perfect, but okay. Michelle nodded at her candidate. Bruno could have his private FaceTime, and then they could get out of here. Inside the viewing room, Bruno closed the door behind him and walked over to the open coffin. There was another coffin against the far wall. It was also open, but empty. The deceased's coffin was resting on a raised platform with a white skirting that was surrounded waist-high with an assortment of beautiful flowers. Bruno paid his respects to the body lying there, murmuring, "So long, Bill," as he turned to the widow, who'd returned to her chair. He knelt in front of her, gently held one of her hands. "I'm so sorry, Mildred. So very sorry. He was a good man." The bereaved looked up at him from behind the veil, smiled, and then looked down again. Bruno's expression changed, and he looked around, though the only other occupant of the room was in no condition to eavesdrop. "Now, you mentioned something else you wanted to talk about. In private." "Yes," the widow said in a very low voice. "I'm afraid I don't have much time, Mildred. What is it?" In answer, she placed a hand on his cheek, and then her fingers touched his neck. Bruno grimaced as he felt the sharp prick against his skin, and then he slipped to the floor, unconscious.
Chapter 2.
Michelle paced in the hallway, checking her watch and listening to the somber music wafting over the sound system. If you weren't sad, depressed, or perhaps even suicidal before coming in here, you would be after 5 minutes of listening to this brain-numbing tripe, she concluded. She was livid that Bruno had closed the door, but she had let it go. You weren't supposed to let a protectee out of your sight, but the realities of life sometimes trumped the rulebook. Still, she looked at one of her men and asked for the 5th time, "You're absolutely sure it's clean?" He nodded. After waiting a bit more, she went over to the door and knocked. "Mr. Bruno, we need to get going, sir." There was no answer, and Michelle let out an inaudible sigh. She knew that the other agents in her detail, all of them her senior in years with the service, were watching her intently to see how she'd handle herself. Only 7% of the approximately 2,400 field agents were women, with very few in positions of authority. Yes, it was not easy. She knocked again. "Sir." Another few moments passed, and Michelle felt her stomach muscles start to tighten. She tried the doorknob and looked up in disbelief. "It's locked." Another agent stared at her, equally perplexed. Well, he must have locked it then. "Mr. Bruno, are you all right?" She paused. "Sir, either acknowledge me or we are coming in." "Just a minute." That was Bruno's voice. It was unmistakable. "Okay, sir, but we need to get going." 2 more minutes went by, and she shook her head and knocked on the door again. No response. "Sir, we're already late." She glanced at Bruno's chief of staff, Fred Dickers. "Fred, you care to try?" Dickers and she had long ago reached a mutual understanding. Basically living together 20 hours a day, the detail leader and chief of staff had to get along, at least mostly, for things to work. They still didn't see eye to eye on everything, nor would they ever, but on this issue they were in agreement. Dickers nodded and called out, "John, it's Fred. We really need to get going. We're way off schedule." He knocked on the door. "John? Do you hear me?" Again, Michelle's stomach muscles tightened. Something wasn't right here. She motioned Dickers away from the door and knocked again. "Mr. Bruno, why did you lock the door, sir?" No answer. A bead of sweat broke on Michelle's forehead. She hesitated for an instant, thinking rapidly, and then suddenly yelled through the door, "Sir, your wife is on the phone. There's been a serious accident involving one of your kids." The response was chilling. "Just a minute." She barked at the other agents with her, "Take it down, take it down." They put their shoulders to the door once and then twice, and then it gave way and they swarmed into the room. A room that was empty, except for a dead man.
Chapter 3.
A funeral procession had started off. There were only about a dozen cars in the column as it headed out along the tree-lined drive. Before the last car disappeared down the road, Michelle and her team had burst out the front door of the funeral home and spread out in all directions. "Lock this whole area down," she shouted at the agent stationed by Bruno's motorcade. They raced to carry out her orders. She spoke into her walkie-talkie. "I need reinforcements. From where I don't care, just get them, now. And get the FBI on the horn." Her gaze fixed on the rear end of the last car in the funeral procession. Heads would roll over this. Her head would roll. Right now, though, all she wanted was to get John Bruno back, preferably living. She saw reporters and photographers pouring out of the media trucks. Despite the nice photo op it would have made, and Fred Dickers' entreaties that he should allow it, Bruno had shown some backbone and refused their request to come inside the funeral home. They hadn't taken the news well. Now they were erupting with full journalistic force as they sensed a story of far greater magnitude than a candidate's visit to pay his last respects to an old friend. Before they could get to her, Michelle grabbed the arm of a uniformed officer who had come running up, apparently awaiting instructions. "Are you security here?" she asked. He nodded, his eyes wide, his face pale. He looked like he might either faint or wet his trousers. She pointed down the road. "Whose funeral procession is that?" Harvey Killebrews. They're taking him to Memorial Gardens. I want you to stop it." The man looked dumbly at her. "Stop it? Somebody's been kidnapped, and that," she pointed at the procession, "would be a great way to get him out of the area, don't you think?" "Okay," he said slowly. "Yeah. Then I want you to search every vehicle, in particular the hearse. Got it?" "The hearse? But, ma'am, Harvey's in there." Michelle looked at his uniform. He was a rent-a-cop, but she didn't have the luxury of being picky. She eyed his name tag and said in a very quiet tone, "Officer Simmons." "Officer Simmons, how long have you been, in the security business?" "About a month, ma'am. But I'm weapons certified. Been hunting since I was 8 years old. Shoot the wings off a mosquito." "That's great. A month." He actually looked greener than that. "Okay, Simmons, listen carefully. My thinking is that the person is probably unconscious, and a hearse would be a great way to transport an unconscious person, don't you agree?" He nodded, apparently finally getting her point. Her face turned to a scowl and her voice to the crack of a pistol. "Now move your ass and stop that procession and search those vehicles." Simmons went off at a dead run. Michelle ordered several of her men to follow him to oversee and help with the operation and commanded other agents to begin a thorough search of the funeral home. It was just possible that Bruno was hidden somewhere inside. She then pushed her way through the reporters and photographers and set up her command center inside the funeral home. From there, she got back on the horn, consulted local maps, and coordinated more efforts, establishing a 1-mile perimeter with the funeral home as its center. Then she made the call she didn't want to make, but had to. She phoned her superiors and said the words that would forever remain attached to her name and wrecked career at the Secret Service. "This is Agent Michelle Maxwell, detail leader for John Bruno. I'm reporting that I've lost the protectee. Apparently John Bruno has been kidnapped. The search is ongoing and local law enforcement and the FBI have been contacted." She could feel the axe already descending upon her neck. She joined her team of men who were tearing the funeral home apart from top to bottom looking for Bruno. Doing all of this without disturbing the crime scene was problematic at best. They couldn't interfere with the investigation to follow, but they had to search for the missing candidate. Inside the viewing room where Bruno had disappeared, Michelle looked at one of the agents who'd scoped the room out before the candidate entered it. "How the hell could this have happened?" she demanded. He was a veteran with the service, a good agent. He shook his head in disbelief. "The place was clean, Mick. Clean." Michelle often went by Mick at work. It made her seem more like one of the boys, which she'd grudgingly conceded was not such a bad thing. "Did you check out the widow? Question her?" He looked at her skeptically. "What? Give an old woman the 3rd degree with her husband lying in a coffin 5 feet away? We looked in her purse, but I didn't think a body cavity search was really appropriate." He added, "We had 2 minutes to do it. You tell me anyone who could have done a proper job in 2 minutes." Michelle stiffened as the meaning of the man's words became clear. Everyone would be looking to cover his butt and federal pension over this one. Stupid now when you looked at it, giving them only 2 minutes. She checked the doorknob. It had been rigged to lock when closed. A coffin 5 feet away. She looked over at the copper-colored box. The funeral director was called for. He was paler now than even a mortician should be. Michelle asked him if the body was indeed that of Bill Martin. "Yes," the man said. "And you're sure the woman in here was Martin's widow?" "What woman would that be?" he asked. "There was a woman dressed all in black with a veil sitting in this room. I don't know if it was Mrs. Martin or not. I didn't see her come in. I'll need Mrs. Martin's phone number. And nobody who works here can leave, not until the FBI has arrived and completed its investigation. Understood?" If possible, the man grew even paler. "The FBI?" Michelle dismissed him, and then her gaze fell on the coffin and the floor in front of it. She bent down to pick up some rose petals that had fallen there. As she did so, she was eye level with the skirting that ran around the coffin. She reached over the flowers and carefully drew aside the fabric, exposing wood paneling. Michelle tapped on the wood. It was hollow. Using gloves, she and another agent lifted out one of the wood sections, revealing a space that could easily have concealed someone. Michelle could only shake her head. She'd blown this all around. One of her men came up to her with a device in a plastic bag. "Some sort of digital recorder," he reported. "That's how they generated Bruno's voice," she said. "Must have gotten a snippet of him from somewhere and used it to keep us at bay while they made their getaway. They must have thought the phrase 'just a minute' would handle most queries from us. You tripped them up with your remark about Bruno's kids. There must be a wireless bug around here somewhere, too." Michelle read his thoughts. "Because they'd have to be able to hear us to make the recorded voice answer when I called out." "Right." He pointed at the far wall where a section of the upholstered wall covering had been pulled back. "There's a door there. A passageway runs behind that wall." "So there's their exit." She handed him the plastic bag. "Put it back exactly where you got it. I don't need a lesson from the FBI on maintaining the integrity of a crime scene." "There must have been a struggle. I'm surprised we didn't hear anything," said the agent. "How could we, with that death music bellowing everywhere?" she snapped. She and the agent went down the passageway. The empty coffin on a rolling table had been left at a doorway here that opened onto the back of the building. They returned to the viewing room, and the funeral home director was called back in and shown the hidden doorway. He looked perplexed. "I didn't even know that was there." "What?" Michelle said incredulously. "We've only been operating this business for a couple of years. That's when the only funeral home in the area went out of business. We couldn't use that building because it had been condemned. This place was a lot of things before it was a funeral home. The current owners did minimal improvements. In fact, these viewing rooms went fairly unchanged. I had no idea there was a door or passageway there." "Well, somebody certainly did," she said bluntly. "There's a door at the end of that hall that opens to the rear of the building. Are you telling me you didn't know about that either?" He said, "That part of the facility is used for storage and is accessed by entrances inside the building." "Did you see any vehicle parked out there earlier?" "No, but then I don't go around there." "Anybody else see anything?" "I'll have to check." "No, I'll check. I can assure you, this is a very respectable establishment. You have secret hallways and exit doors you know nothing about. Aren't you worried about security?" He looked at her blankly and then shook his head. "This isn't some big city. There's never any serious crime." Well, that streak was just broken. "Do you have Mrs. Martin's phone number?" He handed it over, and she was called. There was no answer. Alone for now, Michelle stood in the middle of the room. All those years of work, all that time proving she could do the job, it was all down the drain. She didn't even have the consolation of having hurled her body in front of a would-be assassin's bullet. Michelle Maxwell was now part of history, and she knew she was also history with the Secret Service. Her career was over.
Chapter 4.
The funeral procession was stopped and each car was searched, as was the hearse. It was Harvey Killebrew, devoted father, grandfather, and husband, lying in there when they opened the casket. Virtually all the mourners were elderly and obviously frightened by all the men with guns, and there didn't seem to be a kidnapper within the bunch. But still the agents directed all the cars and the hearse back to the funeral home. Rent-a-cop Simmons approached a Secret Service agent who was climbing into his sedan to lead the caravan back to the funeral home. "What next, sir?" "Okay, what I need is this road watched. Anyone trying to come out, you stop. Anyone coming in, you stop, and check for appropriate credentials. We'll get you some relief as soon as we can. Until then, here is where you'll be. Got it?" Simmons looked very nervous. "This is really big, isn't it?" "Sonny, this is the biggest thing you'll ever have happen in your entire life. Let's just hope it turns out okay." But I kind of doubt that. Another agent, Neil Richards, ran up and said, "I'll stay, Charlie. Probably not a good idea to leave him here all by himself." Charlie glanced at his colleague and said, "Sure you don't want to come back and join the party, Neil?" Richards smiled grimly and said, "I don't want to be within a mile of Michelle Maxwell right now. I'll stay with the kid." Richards climbed into the vehicle next to Simmons, who maneuvered his van so that it blocked the road. They watched as the caravan of agents and mourners passed out of sight and scanned the countryside in all directions. There was no sign of anyone. Simmons kept his hand firmly on the butt of his gun, his black leather glove crinkling as he squeezed the pistol grip. He reached over and turned up the volume on his police scanner and then looked nervously at the veteran agent. He said in a loud voice, "I know you probably can't tell me, but what the hell happened back there?" Richards didn't bother to look at him. "You're right. I can't tell you." Simmons said, "I grew up here. Know every inch of the place. If I was trying to get somebody out of here, there's a dirt lane about a half-mile down the road. You cut through there and go out the other side, you're 5 miles away before you even know it." Richards now glanced at him and said slowly, "Is that right?" He leaned toward Simmons and reached inside his coat pocket. The next moment, Secret Service agent Neil Richards was lying face down on the seat, a small red hole in the center of his back, the stick of gum he had pulled from his pocket still clenched in his hand. Simmons looked in the back of the van where the woman was taking the suppressor off her small-caliber pistol. She had been secreted in a small area under the van floor's false bottom. The chatter from the police scanner had covered the slight noise she made coming out. She said, "Low-caliber dum-dum." Wanted to keep it in the body. Less mess. Simmons smiled. Like the man said, this is really big. He pulled out the dead agent's wireless mic and power pack and threw them deep into the woods. He drove off in the opposite direction of the funeral home. 500 yards down the road, he turned onto a weed-covered dirt lane. They pushed Agent Richards's body out there in an overgrown ravine adjacent to the road. Simmons had been telling the agent the truth. This road was the perfect escape route. Another 100 yards and 2 bends in the road brought them to an abandoned barn, its roof starting to fall in, its doors open. He drove directly into the space, got out and shut the barn doors. Parked inside was a white pickup truck. The woman emerged from the back of the van. She looked nothing like an elderly widow now. She was young, blonde-haired, slender yet muscular and agile, dressed in jeans and a white tank shirt. She had used many names over her brief life and currently went by Tasha. As dangerous as Simmons was, Tasha was even more lethal. She had that essential trait of a polished killer. She possessed no conscience. Simmons took off his uniform, revealing jeans and a t-shirt. Next, he pulled out a makeup kit from the rear of the van and removed the wig, matching sideburns and eyebrows and other parts of his facial disguise. He had been hidden in the hollow platform under Bill Martin's casket, helped carry John Bruno out, then assumed the role of Officer Simmons. From the van, they lifted a large box containing Bruno. The box was marked as containing communication equipment in case anyone had bothered to look. A large tool case was situated against the back of the white pickup's rear window. They took Bruno and placed him inside the tool case and locked it. There were vents in the sides and top of the case, and its interior had been padded. Next, they loaded bales of hay that were stacked in a corner of the barn into the bed of the truck. That mostly concealed the tool case. They jumped into the cab of the truck, donned John Deere caps, and pulled out of the barn, taking another weed-infested dirt road back to the main drag about 2 miles farther down. They passed a stream of police cars, black sedans and SUVs heading, no doubt, to the crime scene. One young cop even smiled at the pretty woman in the passenger side of the truck cab as he sped by. Tasha gave him a flirty look and waved back. The pair drove on with their kidnapped presidential candidate safely unconscious in the back. 2 miles ahead of them was the elderly man who'd sat by the entrance to the funeral home when John Bruno and his entourage passed by. His whittling done, he'd escaped Maxwell's lockdown by a few minutes. He drove alone in his ancient, muffler-rattling Buick Impala. He'd just received the news from his colleagues. Bruno was safely tucked away, and the only casualty had been one Secret Service agent unlucky enough to pair up with a man he undoubtedly believed was harmless. After all this time and work, it had finally begun. He could only smile.
Chapter 5.
The red Ford Explorer pulled to a stop near a large cedar log structure shrouded in deep woods. The place was intricately constructed and far closer to a lodge in scale than a single-family cabin, though only one person lived there. The man got out and stretched his limbs. It was still early and the sun had just begun its ascent. Sean King went up the wide, hand-hewn timber steps and unlocked the door to his home. He stopped in the spacious kitchen to make coffee. As it percolated, he looked around the interior, appraising each mitered corner, the placement of each log, the proportion of window space to wall. He'd pretty much built the place himself over a 4-year period while he lived in a small trailer on the perimeter of the 15-acre spread about 35 miles west of Charlottesville in the Blue Ridge Mountains. The interior was furnished with leather chairs and overstuffed couches, wooden tables, oriental rugs, copper lighting fixtures, plain bookshelves filled with an eclectic assortment of volumes, oil and pastel paintings, mostly done by local artists, and other items one collects or inherits in the course of a lifetime. And at 44 years old, King had lived at least 2 lives thus far. He had no desire to reinvent himself yet again. He went upstairs, made his way along the catwalk that ran the length of the house, and entered his bedroom. Like the rest of the place, it was very organized, things neatly arranged, and not an inch of wasted space. He stripped off his police deputy's uniform and climbed into the shower and let the sweat of a night's work wash away. He shaved, washed his hair, and let the hot water loosen up the surgical scar on his middle finger. He had long ago learned to live with this small souvenir of his days as a Secret Service agent. If he were with the service, instead of living in a beautiful log house in the middle of lovely central Virginia, he'd probably still be packed into a townhouse in some stultifying cookie-cutter bedroom community outside the Washington Beltway, and still married to his ex-wife. He also wouldn't be getting ready to go to his thriving law practice. He certainly wouldn't be a volunteer deputy police officer 1 night a week for his rural community. He'd be about to hop on another plane, watch politicians smile, kiss babies and lie, waiting patiently for the moment when someone tried to kill his guy. What a gig that was for about $100,000 a year and all the frequent flyer miles he wanted. He changed into a suit and tie, combed his hair, drank his coffee in the sunroom off the kitchen, and read the newspaper. The front page was dominated by reports of the kidnapping of John Bruno and the subsequent FBI investigation. King read the main story and related articles carefully, absorbing all relevant details. He clicked on the TV, found the all-news channel, and watched as the newsperson reported on the death of Neil Richards, veteran Secret Service agent. He'd left behind a wife and 4 kids. It was undeniably tragic, sad, all of that. But at least the service took care of the survivors. Neil Richards' family would have their full support. That couldn't take away the loss, but it was something. The reporter then said that the FBI had no comment. Of course not, King said to himself. They never commented on anything, and yet eventually somebody would let slip to somebody who would run to a friend at the Post or the Times, and then everybody would know. Yet what they knew was usually wrong. However, the media beast had an insatiable appetite, and no organization could afford to totally starve it, not even the FBI. He sat up and stared at the image of the woman on the TV standing near a group of folks at a podium. This was the Secret Service part of the story, King instantly sensed. He knew the breed well. The woman looked professional, calm, with a relaxed alertness so familiar to King. And something else was in her expression that he couldn't quite read. There was belly fire, for all of them had some measure of that. Yet there was something more. Subtle defiance, perhaps? The service was assisting the FBI in every way, one of the men said, and they were, of course, also conducting their own internal investigation. The service's inspection division would be handling the investigation, King knew, because they had been all over his butt after the Ritter assassination. Reading the bureaucratic doublespeak, King knew this meant that blame had already been assessed and would be made public as soon as the relevant parties had signed off on the appropriate spin to put on the awful news. Then the press conference was over and the woman was walking away and getting into a black sedan. She was not speaking to reporters on orders from the service, the voiceover said, and the narrator also helpfully identified her as Michelle Maxwell, head of the security detail that had lost John Bruno. So why parade her in front of the press, wondered King. Why wave red meat in front of a caged beast? He almost immediately answered his own question. To give a face to the coming blame. The service was often very good about protecting its own, and agents had screwed up before, been given administrative leave, and then reassigned. However, there might be some political pressure on this one that was screaming out for a head to fall. "Here she is, folks," they might have said. "Go get her, although we still have to do our official investigation, but don't let that stop you." And now King understood the look of subtle defiance in the woman's features. She knew exactly what was going on. The lady was attending her own hanging and not liking it. King sipped his coffee, munched on a piece of toast, and said to her and the TV, "Well, you can be as pissed off as you want, but you can also just kiss your ass goodbye, Michelle." Next, a picture of Michelle Maxwell appeared on the screen while some more background information on the woman was given. A high school All-American in basketball and track, and a heavyweight academic as well, she'd gone on to graduate from Georgetown in 3 years, with criminal justice as her major. If that wasn't high-octane enough, during college she'd turned her considerable athletic talents to another sport and had won a silver medal at the Olympics in women's rowing. A scholar athlete. What could be more inspiring? After a year as a police officer in her native Tennessee, she'd joined the service, ferociously worked her way up the ladder at double quick time, and was currently enjoying the wonderful status of a scapegoat. And a handsome scapegoat she was, King thought, and then caught himself. Handsome? And yet there were masculine qualities about her. The forceful, almost swaggering way in which she walked, the impressive spread of shoulders, no doubt all that rowing, the jawline that seemed to promise extreme obstinacy at frequent intervals. And yet the feminine side was certainly there. She was over 5'9", and despite the broad shoulders, slender, but she had nice, subtle curves, too. The hair was black, straight, and shoulder length, regulation enough for the service, but still stylish. The cheekbones were high and firm, the eyes green, luminous, and intelligent. Clearly, those eyes missed very little. In the Secret Service, such vision was a necessity. The overall look was not that of a classic beauty, but Michelle was probably the girl who was always faster and smarter than all the boys. In high school, she likely had every male gunning to be her best friend. From the look of the woman, though, he doubted any had succeeded on anything other than Maxwell's terms. "Well," he said silently to the TV screen, "there is life after the service. You can start over and recreate yourself. You can be reasonably happy against all the odds. But you never do forget. Sorry, Michelle Maxwell. I speak from experience on that one, too." He checked his watch. Time to go to his real job, drafting wills and leases and charging by the hour. Not nearly as exciting as his old occupation, yet at this stage of his life, Sean King was very much into boring routine. He'd had enough excitement to last him several lifetimes.
Chapter 6.
King backed his Lexus convertible, top down, out of the garage and headed off to work for the second time in 8 hours. The drive took him through winding roads, fabulous views, the occasional wildlife sighting, and not much traffic, at least until he hit the road into town where the automobile volume picked up some. His law office was located on the appropriately named Main Street, the only avenue of consequence in the downtown area of Wrightsburg, a small and relatively new township halfway between the far larger municipalities of Charlottesville and Lynchburg. He parked in the lot behind the two-story white brick townhome that housed King and Baxter, attorneys and counselors at law, as the shingle hanging outside proudly proclaimed. He'd gone to law school 30 minutes away at the University of Virginia before dropping out after 2 years and opting for a career in the Secret Service. At the time, he wanted more adventure than a stack of law books and the Socratic method could provide. Well, he'd had his share of adventure. After the dust settled from the Clyde Ritter killing, he'd left the Secret Service, finished his degree, and opened a solo practice in Wrightsburg. It had now expanded to a 2-lawyer firm, and King's life was finally clicking on all cylinders. He was a respected counselor and friend to many of the most prominent in the area. He gave back to the community as a volunteer deputy police officer and in other ways as well. One of the most eligible bachelors in the area, he dated when he wanted and didn't when he didn't. He had a wide assortment of friends, though few who were intimates. He liked his work, enjoyed his free time, and didn't let much rattle him. His life was marching itself off in carefully constructed and unspectacular measure. He was perfectly fine with that. As he got out of the Lexus, he saw the woman and contemplated ducking back inside, but she'd already spotted him and rushed over. "Hello, Susan," he said as he pulled his briefcase out of the passenger seat. "You look tired," she said. "I don't know how you do it." "Do what?" "Busy lawyer by day, police officer by night." "Volunteer deputy police officer, Susan, and only 1 night a week. In fact, the most exhilarating thing to happen last night was swerving my truck to miss hitting a possum." "I bet when you were with the Secret Service, you went days without sleep." "How exciting, if exhausting." "Not exactly," he said, and started to head to his office. She followed. Susan Whitehead was in her early 40s, divorced, attractive, rich, and apparently dead set on making him her 4th husband. King had handled her last divorce, knew firsthand the number of impossibly annoying quirks the woman had, how vindictive she could be, and his sympathies lay entirely with poor husband number 3. He was a timid, reclusive man, so smashed under the iron fist of his wife that he'd finally gone off on a 4-day drinking, gambling, and sex spree in Las Vegas that had been the beginning of the end. He was now a poorer but no doubt happier soul. King had no interest at all in replacing him. "I'm having a small dinner party on Saturday and was hoping you could come." He mentally checked his calendar, found Saturday night free, and said without missing a beat, "I'm sorry, I've got plans. Thanks anyway. Maybe another time." "You have a lot of plans, Sean," she said coyly. "I'm really hoping that I fit into them at some point." "Susan, it's not good for an attorney and client to become personally involved." "But I'm not your client anymore." "Still, a bad idea. Trust me on that one." He reached the front door and unlocked it before adding, "And you have a great day." He went inside, hoping she wouldn't follow. He waited a few seconds in the foyer of the building, breathed a sigh of relief when she didn't charge in, and headed up the stairs to his office. He was almost always the first in. His partner, Phil Baxter, was the litigation arm of the 2-person firm, while King handled all the other areas. Wills, trusts, real estate, business deals, the steady moneymakers. There was a lot of wealth secreted in the quiet nooks and crannies around Wrightsburg. Movie stars, business tycoons, riders, and other enriched souls called this area home. They loved it for its beauty, solitude, privacy, and local amenities in the form of good restaurants, shopping, a thriving cultural community, and a world-class university down the road in Charlottesville. Phil was not an early riser. Court did not open until 10, but he worked very late, the opposite of King. By 5 o'clock, King was usually back home, puttering in his workshop or fishing or boating on the lake that his house backed up to, while Baxter labored on. The two, consequently, made a nice match. He opened the door and went in. The receptionist/secretary wouldn't be there yet. It was not quite 8. The chair lying on its side was the first thing that caught his eye, and after that the items that were supposed to be on the receptionist's desktop but were now strewn across the floor. His hand went instinctively to his holstered gun, only he had no holster or gun. All he had was a really kick-ass codicil to a will he'd drafted that would intimidate only the future heirs. He picked up a heavy paperweight from the floor and peered around. The next sight froze him. There was blood on the floor by the door leading into Baxter's office. He moved forward, holding the paperweight ready. With his other hand, he pulled out his cell phone, dialed 911, and spoke quietly and clearly to the dispatcher. He reached out his hand to the doorknob, thought better of it, and pulled a handkerchief out of his pocket so no prints would be smeared. He slowly eased the door open, his muscles tensed, ready for an attack, yet his instincts told him that the place was empty. He looked into the darkened space and used his elbow to flick on the light. The body was lying on its side directly in front of King. A single gunshot wound to the center of the chest, exiting out the back. It wasn't Phil Baxter. It was another man, very well known to him, though. And this person's violent death was about to shatter Sean King's peaceful existence. He let out the breath he'd been holding in, and it all hit him in a blinding instant. "Here we go again," he muttered.
Chapter 7.
The man was sitting in his Buick and watched as the police cars pulled up in front of King's Law Building and the uniformed officers raced inside. His appearance had changed much since he'd sat playing the role of an old man whittling in front of the funeral home while John Bruno was being carried away. The suit he'd worn that day was 2 sizes too large to make him look small and emaciated. The dirty teeth, whiskered face, moonshine flask, whittling, and a wad of chew in the mouth were all carefully designed to draw the eye to him. And the observer would come away with an indelible impression of who and what he was. And that conclusion would be absolutely incorrect, which was the whole point, really. He was younger now, perhaps by more than 30 years. Like King, he had recreated himself. He munched on a buttered bagel, sipped his black coffee, and quietly pondered King's reaction to the discovery of the body in his office. Shocked at first, and then perhaps angry, but not surprised. No, not really surprised when one thought about it. As he considered this, he turned on the radio, which was always set to the local news channel, and he got the 8 o'clock report, which started off with the abduction of John Bruno, the lead story for just about every news service worldwide. It had even chased the Middle East and professional football from the minds of many Americans, at least temporarily. The man licked his fingers clean of butter and sesame seeds as he listened. The story had to do with Michelle Maxwell, the Secret Service detail leader. She'd been officially placed on administrative leave, which, he knew, meant she was 1 foot from the professional grave. So the woman was out of the game, at least officially. Yet, unofficially. That was why he'd memorized Maxwell's every feature as she passed by him that day. It wasn't out of the question that he'd confront her again at some point. He already knew her complete background, but the more information, the more intelligence, the better. She was a woman who might sit home and grow bitter, or one who'd charge forward and take risks. From the little he'd seen of her, he thought the latter more likely. He refocused on the scene unfolding in front of him now. Some of the townsfolk just showing up for work or opening their shops were wandering toward the lawyer's office as yet another police car and then a crime scene van pulled into the small parking lot. This was clearly something new for the respectable little metropolis of Wrightsburg. The men in uniform hardly seemed to know what to do. It was all so heartening to the man as he munched on his bagel. He'd waited so long for all of this. He intended to enjoy it. And there was much more to come. He noted once again the woman standing outside the office. He'd seen Susan Whitehead when she approached King in the parking lot. A girlfriend? A would-be lover was probably more accurate, the man deduced from the encounter he'd witnessed. He raised his camera and took a couple of shots of her. He waited for King to come out for air, but that was probably not going to happen. King had covered much ground in his rounds as a deputy, So many back roads to traverse. Lonely roads they were, too. Anything could be out there in the thick woods waiting for you. And yet, where was one really safe these days? Inside a zippered bag in his trunk was a very special item that had to go to a special place. In fact, now was the perfect opportunity to do so. After tossing the remains of his breakfast in a garbage can on the sidewalk, he put the rusted Buick in gear and drove off, muffler rattling. He pulled down the street, glancing once in the direction of King's office, and flippantly gave a thumbs-up sign. As he passed by Susan Whitehead, who was staring at King's office, he thought, maybe I'll be seeing you sooner rather than later. The Buick disappeared down the road, leaving a stricken Wrightsburg in its wake. Round 1 was now officially over. He could hardly wait for round 2.
Chapter 8.
Walter Bishop, a man very high up in the Secret Service, paced in front of Michelle Maxwell, who sat at a small table and watched. They were in a small conference room deep inside a government building in Washington, filled with people reeling from recent events. Over his shoulder, he said, "You should feel relieved you're only being placed on admin leave, Maxwell." "Oh, yes. I'm thrilled you've taken my gun and badge." "I'm not stupid, Walter. Judgment has already been passed. I'm gone." "The investigation is ongoing. In fact, it's just beginning." "Right. All those years of my life down the toilet." He whirled and snapped, "A presidential candidate was kidnapped right under your nose. A first in the agency's history. Congratulations. You're lucky you're not in front of a firing squad. In some other countries, you would be." "Walter, don't you think I feel that, too? It's killing me." "Interesting choice of words. Neil Richards was a fine agent." "I know that, too," she snapped back. "Do you think I knew that this rent-a-cop was in on it? There is no one in the service who feels worse than I do about Neil. You never should have allowed Bruno in that room alone. If you'd simply followed standard procedures, this never would have happened. At the very least, that door should have been open far enough for you to see your man. You never, ever take your eyeballs off your protectee. You know that. That's Protection Detail 101. Michelle shook her head. "Sometimes, on the job, in the middle of all the things we have to put up with, you strike compromises to keep everybody happy. It's not our job to keep people happy. It's our job to keep them safe." "Are you telling me this is the first time a judgment call was made in the field to let a protectee in a room without an agent?" "No, I'm saying this is the first time that call was made and something like this happened. It's strict liability, Michelle. No excuses will avail. Bruno's political party is up in arms. Some nuts are actually saying the service was paid off to knock Bruno out of the race." "That's absurd." "I know it is, and you know it is, but you get enough people saying it, well, then the public starts believing it." Michelle had perched on the edge of her seat during this exchange. Now she sat back and looked calmly at the man. "Just so we're clear, I accept full responsibility for what happened, and none of my men should be affected. They were following orders. It was my call, and I blew it. Good of you to say. I'll see what I can do about that." He paused and added, "I suppose you wouldn't consider resigning?" "No, Walter, I really wouldn't. And just so you know, I'm hiring an attorney." "Of course you are. This is America. Here, any screw-up can hire a lawyer and actually get money for being incompetent. You must be so proud." Michelle suddenly had to blink back tears at this stinging rebuke, yet part of her thought she deserved it. "I'm just protecting myself, Walter, just like you would if you were in my position." "Right. Of course." The man put his hands in his pockets and glanced toward the door in a show of dismissing her. Michelle rose. "Can I ask one favor?" "Certainly you can ask, although you have unbelievable balls to do so." "You're not the first person to notice that," she said coolly. He waited expectantly without replying. "I want to know how the investigation is going." "The FBI is handling all of that. I know, but they must be keeping the service informed. They are, and that information is for service personnel only. Meaning I'm not? You know, Michelle, I had my doubts when the service started actively recruiting women. I mean, you spend money to train an agent and then poof, she gets married, has babies, and retires. All that training, money, time down the drain. Michelle couldn't believe she was listening to this, but she remained silent. But when you came on board, I thought, now this gal has what it takes. You were the poster woman for the service. The best and the brightest. And with it came high expectations. Every agent here has high expectations thrust upon them, nothing less than perfection. He paused and added, I know that your record was spotless before this. I know that you were moving up rapidly. I know that you're a good agent. But you messed up. We lost a protectee, and an agent lost his life. It's not necessarily fair, but there you are. It wasn't really fair for them either. He paused again, and his eyes took on a faraway look. You may stay with the service in some capacity, but you'll never, ever forget what happened. It'll be with you every minute of every day for the rest of your life. And that will hurt you far worse than anything the service could do to you. Trust me. You sound pretty sure about that. I was with Bobby Kennedy at the Ambassador Hotel. I was a rookie cop in L.A., assigned to do local backup for the Secret Service when RFK came through. I just stood there and watched a man who should have gone on to be president bleed to death on the floor. Every day since then, I've wondered what I could have done differently that would have prevented it from happening. It was one of the major reasons I joined the service years later. I guess I wanted to make up for it somehow. His gaze caught hers. I never did make up for it. And no, you never forget.
Chapter 9.
With the press staking out her townhouse in suburban Virginia, Michelle checked into a hotel in D.C. She used the breathing space to snatch a quick, informative lunch with a girlfriend who happened to be an FBI agent. The Secret Service and the Bureau didn't always see eye to eye. Indeed, in federal law enforcement circles, the Bureau was the 800-pound gorilla in relation to all the other agencies. However, Michelle liked to remind her FBI buddies that their agency had been founded with 7 former Secret Service agents. Both women were also members of WIFL, or Women in Federal Law Enforcement. It was a support network with conventions and annual meetings, and though her male colleagues loved to ribber about it, WIFL had been a great tool for Michelle as she confronted issues at work related to her gender. Her friend was clearly nervous about meeting with Michelle, but Michelle had helped her earn an Olympic silver medal, thereby securing a bond that almost nothing could break. Over Caesar salads and iced tea, Michelle was given the results of the investigation thus far. Simmons was a member of the security service that had guarded the funeral home, although he wasn't supposed to be on duty that day. In fact, the funeral home was only patrolled at night. Simmons, of course that wasn't his real name, had disappeared. The paper trail at the company was useless. None of Simmons's information checked out. Stolen Social Security number, fake driver's license and references, the works, all expertly done. He'd been employed there less than a month. Thus far, Simmons was a major dead end. When he came running up, I thought he was just some green rent-a-cop, so I commandeered him and put him into action. We didn't even search his van. Bruno was obviously hidden in the back somewhere. I played right into his hands, gave him a perfect opportunity to kill one of my men. In her misery, Michelle put her face in her hands. With an effort, she recovered, pushed a forkful of lettuce in her mouth, and chewed so hard her teeth hurt. Before they pulled the plug on me, I found out that they got the slug out of Neil Richards. It was a dum-dum. Probably never get a ballistic match, even if we lay our hands on the probable weapon that fired it. Her friend agreed and then told Michelle that the van had been discovered in an abandoned barn. It was being run for prints and other microscopic indicators, but nothing had turned up thus far. Mildred Martin, wife of the deceased, had been found at her home, working quietly in her garden. She had been planning to go and see her husband later that night with friends and family. She hadn't called John Bruno and asked him to come to the funeral home. Her husband had been Bruno's law supervisor, and they'd been close. If the candidate wanted to come and see her dead husband, he could have. It was simple as that, she told investigators. Yet, why did Bruno scramble his schedule and go to see Martin at the funeral home at the last minute? Asked Michelle. It was just dropped on us out of the blue. According to his staff, he received a call from Mildred Martin that morning asking him to come and see her husband at the funeral home. And according to Dickers, Bruno's chief of staff, Bruno was agitated after getting the call. Well, a close friend of his had died. But Dickers also says Bruno already knew that Martin was dead. So you think there's more to it? Well, she picked a time when there weren't that many people at the funeral home. And a few things Bruno said after the call led Dickers to believe there was more to the meeting than simply paying last respects. So that may be why he pushed me so hard to leave them alone in there. Her friend nodded. Well, depending on what the widow had to say, I suppose Bruno would want it to be private. But Mildred Martin said she didn't call. Somebody impersonated her, Michelle. And if Bruno hadn't come, she answered her own question, then they would have just left. And if I'd gone in with him, they wouldn't have tried it. And Neil Richards. Her voice trailed off. What else do you have? Our thinking is that this had been planned for some time. I mean, they had to coordinate a lot of different things, and they executed it to perfection. They must have had inside sources on Bruno's campaign. How else would they know his schedule? Well, one way was his campaign's official website. The event he was going to when he took a detour to the funeral home had been scheduled for quite some time. Damn it, I told them not to post his schedule on the web. Do you know that a waitress at one of the hotels where we stayed knew more about Bruno's itinerary than we did? Because she'd overheard Bruno and his staff talking about it? They don't bother to tell us until the last minute. Frankly, with all that, I don't know how you do your job. Michelle looked at her sharply. And having Bruno's mentor conveniently die, that started the whole chain of events. The woman was already nodding. Bill Martin was elderly, had terminal cancer in its late stages, and died in bed during the night. Under those circumstances, no report was filed with the medical examiner, and no autopsy was conducted. The attending physician signed the death certificate. However, after what happened, his body was posted, and toxicology tests were run on the post-mortem samples. And they found what? Large amounts of Roxanol, liquid morphine, which he was taking for pain, and over a liter of embalming fluid, among other things. No gastric contents because those had been drained during the embalming. No smoking gun, really. Michelle eyed her friend closely. And yet you don't look convinced. Her friend finally shrugged. Embalming fluid gets into all major vessels, cavities, solid organs, so it's tough to be accurate. But under the circumstances, the medical examiner took a sampling of the middle brain, where typically the embalming fluid doesn't penetrate, and she found a spike of methanol. Methanol? But that's a compound of embalming fluid, isn't it? What if the embalming fluid did get in there? That's a concern. And in case you didn't know, there are differences in embalming fluids. High-budget embalming fluids have less methanol, but more formaldehyde. Low-budget ones, like Martin's, have higher levels of pure methanol. Added to that is that methanol is found in lots of things, like wine and liquor. Martin was reportedly a heavy drinker. That might account for the spike. The Emmy couldn't be sure. Bottom line, though, for a man as terminally ill as Bill Martin, it wouldn't have taken a large dose of methanol to kill him. She took out a file and flipped through it. The autopsy also found organ damage, shrunken mucous membranes, stomach lining torn, all markers for methanol poisoning. And yet he had cancer throughout his body and had undergone radiation and chemotherapy. All in all, the M.E. had a mess on her hands. The probable cause of death was circulatory failure, but there are lots of reasons a very elderly man with a terminal illness would have died from circulatory failure. Yet, killing someone with methanol, knowing he'd probably be embalmed without an autopsy, that's pretty ingenious, said Michelle. Actually, that's pretty damn scary. But he must have been murdered, said Michelle. They couldn't just wait around hoping Martin would die on his own and then have his body at the funeral home precisely when Bruno was passing through. She paused. List of suspects? I really can't say. It's an ongoing investigation, and I've already told you more than I should have. I might have to pass a polygraph on this, you know. When the check came, Michelle was quick to grab it. As they walked out together, her friend said, So what are you going to do? Lie low? Look for another position? The lying low part, yes. The looking for another job, not yet. So what then? I'm not ready to give up my career at the service without a fight. Her friend eyed her warily. I know that look. What are you thinking? I'm thinking you're FBI, and it's better that you don't know. Like you said, you might have to pass a polygraph.
Chapter 10.
The worst day of Sean King's life had been September 26, 1996, the day Clyde Ritter died while then Secret Service Agent King was focusing on something else. Unfortunately, the second worst day of his life happened to be right now. His office had been filled with police, federal agents, and technical crews asking lots of questions and not getting lots of answers. Amid all this forensic foraging, they'd taken fingerprint samples from King, Phil Baxter, and their secretary. For elimination purposes, they said. That could cut both ways, King well knew. The local press had arrived, too. Fortunately, he knew them personally and gave vague answers that they accepted with little comment. The national press would be coming very soon because there was something extremely newsworthy about the murdered man. King had suspected it, and those suspicions were confirmed when a contingent of folks from the U.S. Marshals Service showed up on his doorstep. The dead man, Howard Jennings, had been employed at King's law practice as a title searcher, proofreader, overseer of trust account records, and a gopher, sort of a jack-of-all-trades. His office was on the lower level of the law building. He was quiet, hard-working, and kept to himself. There was nothing whatsoever remarkable about what the man did for a living. However, he was very special in one respect. Jennings was a member of WITSEC, the program more popularly known as Witness Protection. 48 years old with a degree in accounting, Jennings, that of course wasn't his real name, had once been gainfully employed as a bean counter for a criminal organization operating in the Midwest. These folks specialized in racketeering, extortion, and money laundering, and used arson, beatings, disfigurements, and the occasional homicide to get their point across. The matter had attracted great national attention because of the lethality of the organization's methods and the complexities of the case. Jennings had quickly seen the light and helped send a slew of very dangerous folks to penitentiaries. Yet some of the most deadly had escaped the federal net. Hence his enrollment in WITSEC. Now he was a corpse, and King's headache was just beginning. As a former federal agent with high-level clearances, King had dealt with WITSEC in some joint efforts between the Secret Service and the U.S. Marshals. When Jennings interviewed with him, his background check and other due diligence made King suspect that Jennings was in the program. He didn't know for certain, of course. It wasn't like the Marshals Service would confide in him about the identity of one of its people, but he had his suspicions that he'd never shared with anyone. It had to do with Jennings' paucity of references and work background, something that would occur when one has wiped out his former life. King was not a suspect, he was told, which of course meant that he was probably near the top of the list. If he informed the investigators that he believed Jennings was WITSEC, he might very well find himself in front of a grand jury. He decided to play dumb for now. He spent the rest of the day calming down his partner. Baxter was a big, burly former UVA football player who'd spent a couple of years in the NFL riding the bench before going on to become an aggressive and highly competent trial lawyer. However, the ex-jock was not used to corpses in his office. That was a form of sudden death he wasn't very comfortable with. King, on the other hand, had spent years at the Secret Service working counterfeiting and fraud involving very dangerous gangs, and he'd killed men as well. Thus, he was better equipped to deal with a murder than his partner was. King had sent his receptionist, Mona Hall, home for the day. Mona was a frail, nervous type, so the sight of blood and body would not have set well with her. However, she was also a confirmed and accomplished gossip, and King had no doubt that the local phone exchange was being burned up with wild speculation about the homicidal goings-on at the offices of King and Baxter. In a quiet community such as Wrightsburg, that could lead the topics of conversation for months, if not years, to come. With the building now shut down by the feds and under around-the-clock security, King and Baxter had to move its legal operations temporarily to its partners' homes. That evening, the two lawyers carried out boxes, files, and other work to their cars. As beefy Phil Baxter drove off in his equally large SUV, King leaned against the hood of his car and stared up at his office. With lights ablaze, the investigators were still going hard and heavy in there, scrutinizing the place for any clue as to who had put a bullet into the chest of Howard Jennings. King took in the mountain vistas behind the building. Up there was his home, a place he'd built out of the ruin of one life. It had been good therapy for him. Now? He drove home, wondering what the next morning would bring. He ate a bowl of soup in the kitchen while he watched the local news. There were pictures of him on the screen, references to his career at the Secret Service, including his disgraced exit, his law career in Wrightsburg, and assorted speculation about the dead Howard Jennings. He switched off the television and tried to focus on some work he'd brought home. However, his attention kept wandering, and he finally just sat in his den surrounded by his world of law books and boring documents and stared into space. With a jolt, he came out of his musings. He changed into shorts and a sweater, grabbed a bottle of red wine and a plastic glass, and went down to the covered dock behind his house. There he boarded the 20-foot jet boat he kept there, along with a 14-foot sailboat and a Skidoo personal watercraft, or PWC, which was akin to a motorcycle on water, plus a kayak and a canoe. About a half-mile across at its widest point and perhaps 8 miles long with numerous coves and inlets, the lake was very popular with recreational boaters and fishermen. Stripers, bluegill, and catfish filled the deep, clear waters. The summer was over now, the renters and seasonal residents gone. His vessels were on power lifts, and he lowered the jet boat into the water, fired it up, and turned on the running lights. He hit the throttle and went out about 2 miles, breathing in the brisk air, letting it wash over him. He entered an uninhabited cove, cut the engine, dropped anchor, poured a glass of wine, and contemplated his now grim-looking future. When news spread that a person in the WITSEC program had been murdered in his law office, King would once more be in the national spotlight, something he was dreading. The last time, one tabloid went off the deep end, running a story actually claiming he'd been bribed by a violent, radical political group to look the other way while Clyde Ritter was gunned down. Well, the libel laws were still alive and well in the United States, and he'd sued and won a large settlement. He'd used this windfall to build his house and start life anew. Yet the cash hadn't come close to erasing what had happened. How could it? He sat up on the boat's gunwale, kicked off his shoes, stripped off his clothes, and dove into the dark water, stayed under for a bit, and then came up sucking oxygen. The lake was actually warmer than the outside air. His career as a Secret Service agent really came crashing down when a video of the assassination, taken by a local TV news crew covering the Ritter event, was released to the public. It clearly showed him looking away from Ritter far longer than he should have. It showed the assassin drawing his gun, pointing it, firing, killing Ritter, and all the while King had been staring off as though in a trance. The clip even showed children in the crowd reacting to the gun before King realized what was going on. The media had chosen to excoriate King, no doubt fueled by the outcry of Ritter's people and not wanting to appear biased against an unpopular candidate. He could recall most of the headlines. Agent lets eyes wander while candidate dies. Veteran agent blows it. Asleep at his post. or the one that read, "So that's why they wear the shades," which, under different circumstances, might have actually made him chuckle. Worst of all, though, he'd been largely shunned by his fellow agents. His marriage had fallen apart under the strain. Actually, it had started to fall apart long before that. King had been gone far more than he was home, sometimes leaving on an hour's notice, with no fixed return date. Under those pressing circumstances, he'd forgiven his wife's first affair, and even the second. The third time, however, they separated, and when she quickly agreed to a divorce after his world fell in, well, he couldn't say he'd spent a lot of time crying about it. And yet, he'd survived it all and rebuilt his life. And now? He slowly climbed back on board the jet boat, wrapped a towel he kept in the boat around his middle, and drove back. Instead of going to his dock, he cut the engine and running lights and pulled into a small cove a few hundred yards down from his place. King quietly dropped the small mushroom anchor in the water to keep his boat from drifting into the muddy bank. Up near the rear of his house, a beam of light was arcing back and forth. He had visitors. Perhaps it was just the media sniffing around. Or perhaps, he thought, Howard Jennings' killer had come looking for another score.
Chapter 11.
King quietly waded to shore, put his clothes back on, and was now squatting in the darkness behind some bushes. The light still swung back and forth as someone moved through the area that ringed the eastern perimeter of his property. King made his way toward the front of his house, shielded by a wall of trees. There was a blue BMW convertible parked in the driveway that he didn't recognize. He was about to go over to it when he decided the best course of action was to get some hardware. With a nice big pistol in hand, he'd feel a lot better about things. He slipped inside the dark house, got the gun, and went back out a side door. The arc of light had disappeared now, and that had him worried. He knelt down and listened. The sharp crack of a fallen branch reached his ears. It had come from his right, barely 10 feet away. Then came a footstep, and then another. He braced himself, his pistol ready, safety off. He launched himself, hitting the person low and hard and landing on top of him, King's pistol right in his face. Only it wasn't a him. It was a her, and she had a pistol out too. It was pointed at him, the barrels of the two guns almost touching. "What in the hell are you doing here?" he said angrily when he saw who it was. "If you get off me, I might have the breath to tell you," she snapped. He took his time climbing off, and when she reached a hand out for him to assist her, he ignored it. She was wearing a skirt, blouse, and short jacket. The skirt had slid up to nearly her crotch during the collision. As she struggled to regain her feet, she tugged it back down. "Are you in the habit of mugging all your visitors?" she said testily as she put her gun back in the waist clip and brushed herself off. "Most of my visitors don't go sneaking around my property." Nobody answered the front door. "Then you go away and call another time, or didn't your mother teach you?" She folded her arms across her chest. "It's been a long time, Sean." "Has it? I hadn't noticed. I've been kind of busy with my new life." She looked around. "I can see that. Nice place." "What are you doing here, Joan?" "Came to see an old friend who's in trouble." "Really? Who's that?" She smiled demurely. "Murder in your office. That's trouble, isn't it?" "Sure it is. I was talking about the old friend part." She nodded toward the house. "I've driven a long way. I've heard about the southern hospitality around here. Care to show me some?" Instead, he contemplated firing a round over her head. Yet the only way he would find out what Joan Dillinger was up to was to play along. "What sort of hospitality?" "Well, it's almost 9 o'clock, and I haven't had dinner. Let's start with that, and then go from there," she said. "You show up unannounced after all these years and expect me to cook you dinner? You've got some guts. That shouldn't surprise you by now, should it?" As he fixed the meal, Joan explored the main level of his home, carrying the gin and tonic he'd given her. She perched on the counter in the kitchen while he worked away. "How's the finger?" she asked. It only hurts when I'm seriously ticked off. Sort of like a mood ring. And just so you know, it's throbbing like hell right now." She ignored the barb. "This place is spectacular. I heard that you built it yourself." "Gave me something to do." "I didn't know you were a carpenter." "I worked my way through school building things for people who could afford it. And then I decided what the hell, I'd do it for myself." They ate at the table off the kitchen that had a commanding view of the lake. With the meal, they drank a bottle of Merlot he'd fetched from his wine cellar. Under different circumstances, it would have been a very romantic setting. After dinner, they carried their wine glasses into the family room with its cathedral ceiling and walls of window. When he saw she was shivering some, King turned on the gas fireplace and tossed her a throw blanket. They sat across from each other on leather couches. Joan kicked off her heels and curled her legs up under her and then placed the blanket over them. She raised her glass to him. "Dinner was fabulous." She breathed in the wine's bouquet. "And I see you've added sommelier to your list of credentials." "Okay, your belly's full, you're suitably buzzed. Why are you here?" "When something extraordinary entailing a major criminal investigation happens to a former agent, everybody's interested." "And they sent you to see me?" "I'm at a level where I can send myself." "So this is unofficial on your part? Or are you just here to spy for the service?" "I'd characterize it as unofficial. I'd like to hear your side of things." King cradled his glass, fighting an urge to throw it at her. "I don't have a side of things. The man worked for me for a short time. He was killed. Today I found out he was in witness protection. I don't know who killed him. End of story." She didn't respond, but just stared into the fire. She finally rose, padded over to the fireplace, and knelt in front of it, running her hand along the stone facade. "Carpenter and stonemason." I subbed that out. I know my limitations. "That's refreshing. Most men I know won't admit to having any." "Thanks. But I still want to know why you're here." "It has nothing to do with the service, and everything to do with you and me." "There is no you and me." "Well, there was. We worked together at the service for years. We slept together. Given different circumstances, we might have moved on to a more permanent arrangement. I would like to think that if you heard that a man who happened to be in witness protection had been murdered at a place where I worked, and my past was being dredged up again, you might come and see how I was coping." "I think you'd be wrong about that." "Well, that's why I'm here. I wanted to make sure you were all right. I'm glad my miserable situation afforded you this wonderful opportunity to exhibit your compassionate nature." "Sarcasm really doesn't suit you, Sean." "It's late, and it's a long drive back to D.C. "You're right. It's too long a drive, actually." She added, "Looks like you have lots of room." She rose and sat down next to him, uncomfortably close. "You look fit enough to qualify for the FBI's hostage rescue," she said, running an admiring eye over his trim 6'1" frame. He shook his head. "I'm an old man for that stuff. Bad knees, bum shoulder and all." She sighed and looked away, tucking some stray hairs behind her ear. "I just turned 40. Consider the alternative. It's not the end of the world." "Not for a man. 40 and unmarried for a woman, it's not so pleasant." "You look great. Great for 30, great for 40. And you've got your career." "Didn't think I'd last that long." "You lasted longer than me." She put her wine glass down and turned to him. "But I shouldn't have." There followed an uncomfortable silence. "It was years ago," he finally said. "Water under the bridge." "Obviously not. I see the way you're looking at me." "What did you expect?" She picked up her wine again and finished it in one long sip. "You actually have no idea how hard this was for me to come here. I changed my mind about 10 times. Took an hour to decide what to wear. It was more nerve-wracking than securing a presidential inauguration. He had never known her to talk this way. She was always the ultra-confident one, bantering with the boys like she was not only one of them, but the ringleader to boot. "I'm sorry, Sean. I'm not sure I ever said that I was sorry. Bottom line, it was my fault. Case closed." "That's very kind of you." "I just don't have the time or energy to hold a grudge. It's not that important to me." Slipping into her heels, she rose and put on her jacket. "You're right. It is late, and I should be going. I'm sorry if I interrupted your wonderful life. And I apologize for being so concerned about you that I came here to see how you were doing." King started to speak, hesitated, and then, as she headed toward the door, he let out an inaudible sigh and said, "You've had too much to drink to drive these back roads at night. The guest room's at the top of the stairs on the right. There are pajamas in the bureau and your own bath, and whoever gets up first makes the coffee." She turned back. "Are you sure? You don't have to do this." "Trust me, I know that. I shouldn't be doing this. I'll see you in the morning." She looked at him with an expression that said, "Are you absolutely sure you won't come see me before the morning?" He turned and headed away. "Where are you going?" she asked. "I've got some work to do. Sleep tight." Joan went outside and got her overnight bag out of the car. When she came back in, he was nowhere around. The master bedroom looked to be at the far end of the hall. She slipped across and peeked inside. It was dark and empty. She slowly went to her room and closed the door.
Chapter 12.
Michelle Maxwell's arms and legs moved with maximum efficiency, at least as she judged herself by the far lower standards of these post-Olympic days. Her skull cut through the waters of the Potomac as the sun rose and the already heavy air held the promise of a less chilly day. It was here at Georgetown that she'd begun her rowing career. Her muscular thighs and shoulders were burning with the effort she was expending. She'd passed every other scull, kayak, canoe, and comparable vessel on the water, including one that had a 5-horsepower engine. She pulled her skull up to one of the boathouses that sat on the banks in Georgetown, bent over, and took deep, long breaths, the endorphins coursing through her blood, providing a pleasant high. A half hour later, she was in her Land Cruiser heading back to the hotel she'd moved to near Tyson's Corner, Virginia. It was still early and traffic was light, relatively light, that is, for a region that routinely saw clogged highways as early as 5 a.m. She showered and put on a t-shirt and boxers. With no uncomfortable shoes or stockings and no holster chafing her, it felt great. She stretched, rubbed her tired limbs down, and then ordered room service and threw on a robe before her breakfast was delivered. While having pancakes, orange juice, and coffee, she channel-surfed the TV, looking for more news on the Bruno disappearance. Ironic that she was the lead agent in the field that day and was now getting her news on the investigation from CNN. She stopped surfing when she saw a man on TV who looked familiar. He was in Wrightsburg, Virginia, surrounded by news crews and obviously not enjoying it. It took her a few moments to place him, and then she got it. The man was Sean King. She'd joined the service a year or so before the Ritter assassination. Michelle had never known what became of Sean King and had no reason to want to know. But now, as she listened to the details of Howard Jennings's murder, she began to want to know more. Part of it was purely physical. King was a very good-looking man, tall and well-built with close-cropped black hair now heavily graying at the temples. He must be in his mid-40s now, she calculated. He had the sort of face that looked better with lines. It gave him an attraction that he probably never had in his 20s or 30s, when he was probably too pretty boy-looking. Yet it wasn't his handsome features that intrigued her the most. As she listened to the sketchy details leading to Jennings's death, there was something about the murder, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. She opened the copy of the Washington Post that had been delivered to her room and, scanning the pages, found a short but informative article about the slaying. The account also contained facts about King's past, the Ritter fiasco, and its aftermath. As she read the account and then looked at the man on the screen, she felt a sudden, visceral connection to him. They'd both made mistakes on the job, and it had cost them greatly. It appeared King had rebuilt his life pretty dramatically. Michelle wondered if she'd be anywhere near as triumphant in reconstructing her world. She had a sudden inspiration and phoned a confidant of hers at the service. The young man wasn't an agent. He was in administrative support. Every field agent needed to cultivate strong ties to the admin staff, for those were the folks who really knew how to cut through the red tape that plagued most government agencies. He was a huge admirer of Michelle's and would have somersaulted down the hall if she had condescended to have coffee with him. Well, she did so condescend. The price was he had to bring her copies of certain records and other materials. He waffled at first. He didn't want to get in trouble, he said, but she soon persuaded him otherwise. She also got him to agree to slow-walk her admin leave papers such that she would have access to the Secret Service database using her name and password for at least another week or so. They met at a small cafe downtown where she got the records from him. She gave the young man a hug that she let linger just long enough for her to be quite certain that he would continue to do her bidding. When she joined the service, she had not handed in her membership in the female ranks. At one level, it was just another tool. In fact, used judiciously, it was far more powerful even than her 357. As she was getting back into her truck, a voice called out. She turned to see an agent she had leapfrogged over in climbing the career ladder. The look on his face was clear. He was here to gloat. "Who would have thought?" he began innocently. "I mean, your star was shooting straight up. I still can't understand how you let it happen, Mick. I mean, leaving the guy alone in a room you hadn't really swept? What the hell were you thinking?" "I guess I wasn't thinking, Steve." He slapped her on the arm a little harder than he needed to. "Hey, don't worry, they're not going to let their superstar woman fall. You'll get reassigned, maybe guarding Ladybird down in Texas, or maybe the Fords. That way you get 6 months in Palm Springs and 6 in Vail and a sweet per diem. Of course, if it were one of us poor slobs, they'd cut our heads off and forget about us. But who said life was fair? You might be surprised. I might not be with the service when this is all over." He smiled broadly. "Well, maybe life is fair after all. Hey, you take care." He turned to leave. "Oh, Steve." He turned back. "I trust you got the memo that they're doing a computer sweep on everybody's laptop next week. You might want to get that porno stuff off. You know, from that site you keep checking from the office. That might blow your clearances. And who knows, maybe even your wife might find out. And while we're on the subject, are big boobs and a tight ass really worth the risk? I mean, isn't that like so 16-year-old? Steve's smile disappeared. He extended his middle finger to her and stalked off. Michelle couldn't stop smiling all the way back to the hotel.
Chapter 13.
Michelle spread out the documents on her bed, going over them meticulously and making notes along the way. It became apparent that King had had a spotless record and a long list of commendations in his career at the service, at least until that fateful day when his attention wandered and Clyde Ritter paid the ultimate price. During his stint working counterfeiting early on in his career, King had even been wounded when a bust went down badly. He killed 2 men after taking a round in his shoulder, and years later he killed Ritter's assassin, albeit a few seconds too late. That made a total of 3 men he'd gunned down in the line of duty. Michelle had fired thousands of rounds in training, but even in her brief stint as a police officer in Tennessee, she'd never shot anyone for real. She often wondered what that would feel like, whether it would change you, making you either too reckless or too careful to do your job properly. Clyde Ritter's assassin was a professor at Atticus College. Professor Arnold Ramsey was not a prior known threat and had no ties to any radical political organization, although it was later learned he was an outspoken critic of Ritter. He left behind a wife and daughter. Some legacy to leave behind for the kid, Michelle thought. What was she supposed to do when talking about her family? "Hi, my dad was a political assassin, like John Wilkes Booth and Lee Harvey Oswald. He was shot to death by the Secret Service. So what does your dad do?" No one else had been arrested in connection with the assassination. The official conclusion was that Ramsey acted alone. Finished for now with the paper trail, she picked up the video that was part of the official record. She popped it into the VCR underneath the TV and turned it on. She sat back and watched as the scene from the hotel meet and greet during the Ritter campaign materialized on the TV. This video had been taken by a local television crew filming the Ritter event. It had put the final nail in King's coffin. Despite taking great pains to make sure such a mistake was never repeated, the service had chosen not to show this video to its recruits. Perhaps out of embarrassment, Michelle thought. She stiffened when she saw the confident-looking Clyde Ritter and his entourage enter the packed room. She knew little about Ritter other than that he had started life as a TV minister and made a considerable fortune. Thousands of people from across the country had sent him money in amounts large and small. There had been claims that numerous wealthy older women, mostly widows, had given him their life savings in exchange for his promise they'd go to heaven. Yet there was no hard evidence of that, and the furor died down. After leading the quasi-religious life he ran for and was elected to Congress from a southern state, though she didn't know which one. He had a dubious voting record on racial and other issues of civil liberties, and his brand of religion was over the top. Yet he was beloved in his state, and there were enough voters in the country dissatisfied with the direction of the major party platforms that Ritter had run for president as an independent. That grand ambition had ended with a bullet in his heart. Next to Ritter was his campaign manager. Michelle had looked him up in the file, too. He was Sidney Morse. The son of a prominent California attorney and an heiress mother, Sidney Morse had been, strangely enough, a playwright and stage director before turning his considerable artistic talents to the political arena. He earned a national reputation managing large political campaigns, turning them into media-driven extravaganzas with emphasis on sound bites and perception over any kind of substance, and his win rate was astonishingly high. That probably said more for the gullibility of the modern voter than the high standards of the modern candidate, Michelle thought. Morse became a troubleshooter for hire, crossing the political aisle when the money and situation were right. He joined the cause when Ritter's campaign really started to take off and the candidate needed a more seasoned helmsman. Morse had the reputation for being brilliant, crafty, and, when called for, ruthless. All sides agreed that he helped Ritter run a damn near perfect campaign, and from all accounts he enjoyed the hell out of rocking the establishment with his third-party juggernaut. However, Morse had been a political outcast after Ritter's assassination, and his life had been in a downward spiral. Over a year ago, Morse, his mind gone, had been committed to a state mental institution where he'd probably live out the rest of his life. Michelle stiffened again when she saw Sean King directly behind the candidate. She mentally counted off the agents in the room. There weren't that many, she realized. She'd had 3 times that number on her Bruno detail. King was the only agent anywhere near Ritter. She wondered who'd come up with that lousy plan. As an avid student of her agency's history, Michelle knew that the Secret Service's mission had evolved over time. It had taken the tragic deaths of 3 presidents, Lincoln, Garfield, and McKinley, for Congress to act substantively on the issue of presidential security. Teddy Roosevelt received the first real dose of Secret Service protection after McKinley was gunned down, although things were far less sophisticated back then. Even in the 1940s, Harry Truman, Franklin Roosevelt's newly elected vice president, didn't even have a Secret Service agent assigned to him until one of Truman's aides argued convincingly that a person who was a single heartbeat away from becoming the most powerful man in the world was damn well entitled to at least one professional lawman with a gun watching over him. As the meet and greet went on, she watched Agent King do all the right things, his gaze constantly moving. The Secret Service drilled that practice into you. Once, the service had competed with other federal law enforcement agencies to see which of them was best at telling when someone was lying. The service had won, hands down. To Michelle, the reason was obvious. An agent on protection detail spent most of his or her time trying to divine the innermost thoughts and motives of people solely from their exteriors. And then the moment came. King seemed riveted by something to his right. So enthralled was Michelle at speculating on what he could have been looking at that she didn't see Ramsey pull his weapon and fire. She jumped when the sound came and realized that, like King, her attention had also wandered. She rewound the tape and watched Ramsay slip his hand into his coat pocket, partially hiding the movement behind a Ritter sign he was holding with his other hand. You couldn't see the gun clearly until Ramsay pointed it at the candidate and fired. King recoiled, presumably as the bullet exited Ritter and hit him in the hand. As Ritter collapsed, the crowd burst into complete hysteria. The cameraman filming the video had apparently dropped to his knees, and Michelle saw torsos and legs running helter-skelter. Other agents and security personnel were pushed back against the sides of the room by the mad rush of frightened people. It only took seconds and seemed like forever to her. And then the cameraman must have stood again because Sean King returned to the screen. Blood streaming down his hand, King had his gun out, pointed directly at Ramsay, who still held his own weapon. It is a normal human reaction to flinch, panic, and fall to the ground immobile when a shot is fired. Training at the service was designed to override this instinct. When an unknown fired a shot, you moved. You grabbed the protectee and got the hell out of there as fast as you could, often physically carrying the person in the process. King did not do that, principally because Michelle assumed he had a man in front of him holding a gun. King fired once, twice. Calmly, it seemed. He didn't say a word that Michelle could tell. And then as Ramsay fell, King simply stood there looking down at the dead candidate as other agents finally dashed forward and grabbed Ritter, and their training still working, rushed off with him, leaving King behind to face the music. Michelle would have given anything to know what the man was thinking right at that moment. She rewound the tape and watched it again. The bang came as Ramsay fired, but there had been a sound before that. She rewound the tape again and listened intently. There it was, like a beep or a clang or a ding. That was it. A ding. It was coming from the direction where King was staring, and she seemed to hear a slight hush or whooshing sound. She thought rapidly. A ding in a hotel almost always meant that an elevator car had arrived, and the whooshing sound could have been the elevator doors opening. The diagram of the room where Ritter was shot showed a bank of elevators. If an elevator door had opened, had it revealed anything to Sean King? And if so, why hadn't he said? And why hadn't anyone else seen something? Lastly, why hadn't anyone picked up on what she had just noted after having watched the tape a couple...
To keep listening to this audiobook, I've left you a link in the description so you can do it, at no cost thanks to Audible's 30-day free trial.